have just ruined themselves with coffee and chronic use of tea because it stimulates too much adrenaline and too much cortisol. So it antagonizes, cortisol it has a functional relationship with DHEA. And as your cortisol levels rise up, the half-life of cortisol is 400 minutes. So 400 to 500 minutes, depending on how quickly your liver could clear. So if you drink a Starbucks coffee, 8-ounce Starbucks coffee, for example, it's 350 milligrams of caffeine. So let's call it 300. If you're a woman, let's say, and you drink a cup of Starbucks coffee, let's call it at 4 o'clock at night, you'll get 300 milligrams of caffeine. 400 minutes later, you'll have half of that. 400 minutes later, 400 is like what, 4 hours? 4 times 6 is 24. It's more than that. 60 minutes in an hour, 400.
Like 6 hours, something like that.
4 hours, right? Yeah. So if you drink 300 milligrams of caffeine at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at Starbucks because you're feeling tired, you have 150 milligrams of caffeine still floating around in you at 10 o'clock at night. And then at, 1 or 2 a.m., 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, you still have 75 milligrams. And so when you have cortisol, when your cortisol levels are not naturally regulated and don't drop down, melatonin is not released. The cortisol and melatonin are antagonistic in the cycle to each other. Just like as the sun's going down, the moon is coming up. And the more light there is in the air, you don't see the moon during the day, even though it's there, you can't see it because it's the sunlight overpowers it. So cortisol and adrenaline are really sun-like. And then melatonin and all the anabolic hormones, which come out more strongly at night, typically for growth and repair, are also nighttime hormones. So the more stimulated a woman gets with anything that elevates cortisol and triggers adrenaline, which then elevates cortisol, if that's done chronically, the adrenal glands downregulate cortisol production, or they stop producing as much naturally because they're being stimulated all the time. So it's like someone that's overtrained eventually collapses. So they go further and further down, and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and there's a hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, that regulatory system gets disrupted. And his little research shows in physiology that within 7 to 21 days of any repeated influence, you can entrain the system. So within 7 to 21 days, you can actually get addicted to caffeine because it's changing the flow of your hormones and the body becomes expectant upon it to trigger that cascade. And the longer you do it, the longer it takes to get someone's physiological rhythms to self-regulate, and you may never recover after a certain point. In tests with animals, they found that if you take them far enough, then corrective measures won't work. In other words, as long as you don't give them the drug, they're in misery or irrational.
I've